listener production.
Hey, Chris Spyrou with you. Welcome to The Briefing. What if I told you you were being charged more for an already expensive service thanks to a legal loophole the government knows all about but hasn't closed just yet?
We see people often deciding not to have genetic testing that could save their life because they're worried about these financial implications.
That deep dive looking into how insurance companies could be misusing your medical records is coming up in the second half of this episode. First though, let's get into the headlines with Tara Cassidy on Tuesday, the 6th of May.
Morning, Chris, and to you listening, and good morning to Australia's richest woman, Gina Rinehart, who has blamed the coalition's election loss on quote-unquote left media. In an official statement, the mining billionaire says the Australian public was intentionally scared by the media into rejecting Trump-like Make Australia Great policies like cutting government tape, bureaucracy and wastage, which she says are good ideas that the Liberal Party parked in an attempt to appeal to Labor voters, which brought me back to this hilarious moment from a decade ago from Kath and Kim's Magda Zabansky, who pretends to be Gina.
What's mine is mine. What's yours is also mine. What's in the mine is mine, and what's not in the mine is also mine.
Oh my gosh, Tara, you wouldn't believe how many times this skit is quoted in my friendship groups. It's so lame of us, but we do this often. Anyway, the longtime backer of the Libs, who is worth about $46.5 billion, is now urging the party to follow in the likes of right-wing coalitions like those in Italy and Hungary, so politics and economic management in Australia can return to what she's describing as common sense and truth. Very interesting, given the coalition's announcement of a shadow ministry for efficiency, public service cuts, and promises to rip up red tape to address housing. But she's saying they could have gone harder. Don't know if that's the right call given Labor's landslide victory, currently holding 86 seats in the House of Reps while the count continues.
Yeah, and speaking of the Libs, we have an update on who might become their new leader since Dutton lost his seat on Saturday. One of the key names that's being thrown in the ring, Shadow Defence Minister Andrew Hastie, has actually ruled himself out, which removes a significant obstacle for frontrunner Shadow Treasurer Angus Taylor.
Yeah, while the obstacle in Hastie has now been removed, Angus Taylor is still facing competition from Deputy Opposition Leader Susan Lee and Shadow Immigration Minister Dan Tehan. If you want to find out more about who these people are and kind of a little bit about their political track record, hop back to yesterday's afternoon episode. The link to that will also be in the show notes.
Changing pace now, and just a heads up, this next story discusses the deaths of children and might be distressing for some. A woman remains under police guard in hospital this morning after the bodies of 2 young boys were found in a New South Wales home. Police were called to a property at Coonabarabran yesterday afternoon after a welfare concern report was made, and on arrival, officers located the bodies of a 6-year-old boy and 7-year-old boy. A 66-year-old woman known to the pair was arrested and taken to hospital for assessment.
Meantime, in Queensland, in Brisbane South, a woman will front court next month after being charged over the manslaughter of an 11-month-old baby boy at Darra. In April last year, emergency services were called to the property where they found the child unconscious and not breathing. He was later declared dead at the scene, prompting a police investigation.
To the Middle East now, where Israel has approved a plan to expand its military offensive and capture all of Gaza in what's been labelled a conquest. The decision approved by Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu yesterday comes after weeks of failed ceasefire talks and renewed tit-for-tats with Houthi rebels in Yemen, who say that they're striking Israel in solidarity with Hamas. Now, the Houthis' latest strikes, which injured several people at a Tel Aviv airport on Sunday, is part of the rebel group's goal of stopping travel in and out of the country.
Yeah, Israel has vowed to retaliate to those strikes sevenfold. And as for its new plans with Gaza, Netanyahu says it's about destroying Hamas and rescuing its remaining hostages, 24 who are still believed alive, assuring the Strip's 2.1 million people will be moved for their own protection. The operation won't start until after Donald Trump's visit to the region between the 13th and 16th of May, with the senior Israeli official saying the announcement is giving Hamas a window of opportunity to agree to a new ceasefire and hostage deal.
Back home now, police have just seized their biggest haul of illegal tobacco and vapes in history in a single week as part of a crackdown on illegal chop shops, which is what they're calling them. The products, worth an estimated $20.8 million in street value, were seized in a joint effort by Queensland Police, Queensland Health and the TGA.
In it, they seized 76,000 illegal vapes, 19 million illicit cigarettes and 3.6 tonnes of loose illicit tobacco in the raid of over 30 locations from Brisbane to halfway up the Queensland coast. Now, in Queensland alone, since October last year, they reckon they've seized over 230,000 vapes, and police say that these criminals are basically standing over store owners to try force them to sell the products or risk having their shops burnt down, which we have seen many cases of across the country in storefront fire bombings.
Yeah, and I did a deep dive on this kind of topic not that long ago and spoke to a former AFP cop who actually formed the Border Force team that's targeting these illegal vapes and tobacco, and his opinion was that this response is just way too little too late. But look, I'll let you have a listen. We'll chuck the deep dive link in the show notes.
And roll up your sleeves, get your popcorn bowl and strap yourselves in for some wacky-ass outfits, because today is the fashion world's night of nights, the Met Gala, Tara Cassidy. The event's taking place on Monday night New York time, so daytime for us today, with this year's theme, drumroll please, Tailored for You, a reference to menswear and suiting, looking to highlight the cultural and historic impact of black style in menswear, so expect tons of schmick suits.
Yeah, and look, this event brings in celebs from around the globe, and it has for decades, even dating back to when people like Princess Diana and Jackie O attended back in the 70s and then the 90s, and some tickets go for as much as $70,000 a pop, which... is some Aussies' literal annual income. So sadly, you nor I shall ever be attending this event, Chris. But look, there's often some really hilarious and awkward moments that turn into viral memes after the event, which is frankly my favourite part. And some that stand out to me is I remember Doja Cat looking like she came straight from a literal Cats musical, her makeup artist turning her face into a full-blown cat's face in 2023. And then there's just the really bloody weird, like Jared Leto accessorised one year with what looked like a Madame Tussauds wax copy of his own head. Like, it looked like something from a horror film, I'm sorry.
Yeah, it did. He was holding it. It was so funny. The comparisons to him and nearly headless Nick from Harry Potter were rife on the internet that day. It was very, very great. But I mean, I'm less interested in the outfits and accessories, and I am obsessed with the red carpet interviews because we get moments like these. I know it ain't the stallion. If anyone who doesn't know, that's Keke Palmer back in 2021 when she was doing the red carpet interviews. A lot of memes came out of that. So I am hanging on for what's going to come out of today and what memes and viral TikTok sounds will be born.
Absolutely, me too. I will be keeping my eyes peeled. Also, before we go on to today's deep dive, please join me in a very somber moment as we say farewell to this sound for the very last time.
Yes, video calling service Skype has officially gone offline today after an impressive 21 years on the scene. Some very fond memories rushing back the second we played that sound, Tara. I'm not going to lie to you, but that is it for today's headlines. Up next is our deep dive, my deep dive, looking into how our medical records are sometimes secretly being used by big companies to charge you more. Stick around, that's coming up next. Have you ever given away your spit in exchange for health info or to find out more about where you came from? Well, more than 1 million Aussies have, and while it can help you find all the fun genealogy stuff, it can also be life-saving. Our DNA is valuable, but many of us are giving it away for free without thinking where it could go and how it could end up costing you more than what you ever signed up for. Dr. Jane Tiller is a lawyer, genetic counsellor and public health researcher from Monash University. She has all the qualifications to guide us through this maze of genetic privacy. Dr. Jane, welcome to the briefing. Just how valuable is my DNA?
Your DNA?
Yeah. Me personally, how valuable is my DNA?
Well, that depends on who has it, what they might do with it, and what's in your DNA, I suppose.
Well, you're an expert in medical genetic testing, so perhaps we'll start there. What can you tell us about this type of testing and the information it can collect?
Yeah, so genetic testing's been around for many years, and there's many things we know that we can test for in our genes that can tell us about diagnosis of disease. We're starting to develop treatments of disease based on genetics. And something that's really exciting that we're really just moving into with genetics is being able to use genetics to prevent disease. And that's finding people through medical genetic testing who have a predisposition to or a high risk of developing certain diseases. And there are things that we can do if we know we're at high risk of disease, like enter into intensive surveillance programs, take medications. Some people even have surgeries to really prevent that disease altogether or catch it very early.
What examples do you have on hand of how we're seeing this play out in real life?
Yeah, so there's genes that are well known, like the BRCA gene. Many people have heard of that because Angelina Jolie famously has a variant in that gene. It leads to a very high risk of breast and ovarian cancer in particular. And Angelina wrote about her experience. She decided to remove her breasts and then eventually remove her ovaries to really significantly reduce her risk of getting cancer. And these are types of genes that have very, very high risks. So the risk of breast cancer in someone with a BRCA gene variant is over 70%. And so these are very high risks. They often run in families. We see many families ravaged by this kind of genetic and hereditary disease. And we know that if we can test people before they start to get these diseases, we can actually do something to stop it altogether.
And why we've got you on is because sometimes that medical testing that can help us identify genes and prevent diseases can sometimes be misused by certain industries. What can you tell us about that?
When we are consenting people to have a genetic test, it's important to tell them about what all the risks might be of having genetic testing. And we would prefer in those conversations to focus on what the medical risks might be, which are very low when you're doing genetic tests. But a significant risk to people actually is how that genetic data might be used and how they might be discriminated against. And in Australia, this is something that we have to tell every person who's having a genetic test. Their health insurance is not affected by this. We have community rated health insurance in Australia, which means everyone gets the same cost of insurance for the same price if they're in the same kind of age range. But life insurance companies are legally allowed to use people's genetic results to discriminate against them. And that means if you've had a genetic test and you go to apply for life insurance or income protection, disability, those kinds of insurances, they can ask for those results. And if it shows that you have a risk of disease in the future, even if you're perfectly healthy now, life insurers can say, we're not going to cover you, or your premium will be double maybe what the premium would have been if you didn't have that genetic result. And so because of that, we see people saying, I don't want to have this genetic test. It's not worth it to me. I don't want to risk my insurance in the future. Some people are worried about their children's insurance down the track. And so we see people often deciding not to have genetic testing that could save their life because they're worried about these financial implications. And we are involved in a study at Monash Uni called DNA Screen. I co-lead that study. We've been offering genetic testing to young people. So we offered tests to 10,000 young people for things like the BRCA gene, genes that lead to increase of bowel cancer risk and heart disease risk. And we had tens of thousands of people sign up for that study and a huge amount of interest. But of the people who decided not to have testing, when I surveyed them, more than half of them said it was because they were concerned about these insurance implications. So it's a really significant issue that's impacting people's willingness to be involved in this kind of testing and research.
And to be clear, Dr. Jane, for those of our listeners that are listening and they think, well, I've done DNA testing, this is DNA testing specific to those conducted in a medical setting. This isn't consumer DNA testing, things like Ancestry and 23andMe. The obligation extends to medical DNA testing?
Well, actually, it's not quite as clear-cut as that. And so under the law, insurers are allowed to ask you for any genetic test you've had. Now, they're only allowed to discriminate in theory if there is evidence to support that. And so if someone's had a genetic test that doesn't show any medical risk and the insurer asks have you had genetic testing? And you say, I've had my ancestry testing done. There's no evidence at the moment to support necessarily their right to discriminate. However, if they could demonstrate that there is some evidence, that is technically not something that is currently banned under the law. If there was evidence that certain test results that came out of some of those recreational testing companies were vulnerable to this kind of thing, if there is evidence that it does show an increased risk of disease, that is something that technically could be used. And this really raises significant issues around certain ethnic groups that might have more significant risk of disease than other ethnic groups. If there's information in ancestry testing that shows that, we don't know of any cases yet where that's being used by insurers, but in the future that might be something that could happen.
What are some ethnic groups there that you and your colleagues are concerned that might be discriminated against?
We know that there are some particular gene changes that are more common in certain groups of people. Ashkenazi Jewish people have higher risks of some variants in the BRCA genes, for example, than the general population. And there are other ethnic groups that have higher risks for certain heart disease gene variants. These are things that aren't really being used at the moment as far as we know by insurers, but I guess there's always a risk that that might be something that is used in the future, and certainly something that we wouldn't want people to be vulnerable to.
You've mentioned there that the law seems to be a little all over the shop here, but we know life insurers are exempt. Why is that the case, and are there concerns that these exemptions could extend beyond life insurance?
The reason for that is because there's a specific exception in the Act which allows life insurers to discriminate. And so how it works is the Act actually does prohibit the use of genetic results to discriminate against people. That Act is the Disability Discrimination Act. But there's a special carve-out in that Act that specifically allows risk-rated insurers, so insurers like life insurers who use risk to differentiate on their pricing. It allows them to discriminate on the basis of a number of things, including genetic test results. And so what we've been working on for many years is to ask the government to close that loop and to remove that exception as it relates to genetic information. And this is something that many other countries have already done. We're not leading the world in any way in that there are many countries who've already banned the use of genetic results in life insurance because of this fear and this deterrent effect that it has on people uptaking genetic testing. And we had a great outcome last September when the government actually, following consultation, announced that they would implement a total legislative ban, so put in place a ban in legislation that stops insurers from being allowed to ask for or use genetic results in their underwriting process to discriminate against people. Unfortunately, that promise hasn't actually turned into legislation yet.
I do want to ask about this exemption that's carved out in the current and existing legislation. We do know that legal discrimination is a thing. There are circumstances in which the government and our lawmakers allow discrimination to take place. So I'm thinking about, for example, and this is a very soft example, but female-only gyms, for example, that is where we see positive, legal discrimination taking place. Why historically are the life insurance companies exempt from following the rules, essentially?
Yeah, so that comes back to the idea of risk rating. And as I mentioned, health insurance is community rated, and that is mandated by law. So a health insurer is not allowed to use different risks in your family history or diagnosis of disease to make your health insurance more expensive. This is something that they do in other countries, but in Australia we don't. Risk rate on the basis of health insurance. But life insurance has always been risk rated. And that means that they are allowed to say, well, you've already had a heart attack, so we are going to exclude you from future cover for heart attacks, or we are going to make your premium more expensive. Or perhaps if you've had a heart attack and you're 60 years old, you can't get life insurance at all. They just won't offer you cover. Now, they're allowed to do this because that's the model on which their entire business is built. We don't have community-rated life insurance or income protection insurance. And so they are allowed to discriminate, which is the true word for what they do, between people based on these kind of different risks that they bring to the risk pool. Other types of insurance work this way as well. Travel insurance, for example, is more expensive if you have medical conditions because you're more likely to claim in their view while you're traveling. Car insurance, you probably know if you're a young male, your car insurance is far more expensive than if you are a middle-aged female, unless you've had lots of crashes, and then it's more expensive. So this risk rating is really something that is embedded into types of insurance where people or rather where insurance companies are able to use that risk information to differentiate on price or discriminate on price between people. And so we are saying to the government, this is not an appropriate exception. This is not something that should be allowed. Other countries have already acted in this way. We already have an act that prohibits discrimination. We don't need a whole new act, but we do need to amend that act to make sure that insurers are subject to that ban as it applies to that kind of information.
Have the life insurers showed any willingness to come to the table when it comes to this?
Yeah, that's an excellent question because in the last few years, the life insurance industry has been actually quite opposed to this idea. And when the consultation was first run by the government about what should be done, they were not in support of a total ban. However, when the government made the announcement last September, the life insurance industry body, the Council of Australian Life Insurers, actually stood up and said, we support this and times have changed and this is good for industry, this is good for insurers, and they actually called on the government to implement that legislation quite quickly. So it's been an interesting sort of progression in policy for the life insurance industry, but they are now absolutely supporting this. And this is one more reason why it's been disappointing that the government hasn't actually followed through on their promise in putting this legislation in place. And we're really hoping that after the election, that support will continue from all quarters and it will be something that's done quite quickly.
Great. Dr. Jane, thank you so much for joining us on The Briefing.
Thanks, Chris.
That was Dr. Jane Tiller from Monash Uni speaking with me there. And if you want to find out more about your DNA and how it can be used against you, search Secrets We Keep, Should I Spit, wherever you get your podcasts right now. That is it for this episode of The Briefing. Thanks so much for listening. Before you go, though, we'd love it if you could share this episode with someone who you think might enjoy it. It's a really easy way you can support us and all that we do here at The Briefing. So we're sharing our social posts. Check us out on Instagram at The Briefing Podcast and on TikTok and YouTube. Just search Listener Newsroom. Don't forget, we'll be back in your feeds with another episode this afternoon, hosted by Natasha Belling. And Tara Cassidy and I will be back with you tomorrow morning for another dose of headlines and a deep dive. But until then, I'm Chris Spyrou. Catch you next time.
Listener.